we are rounding out the Halloween episodes. This is the third one, Halloween Forensics, episode 3. And we're going to talk mainly about body parts today, and exhumed bodies are going to be the kind of the main idea. And, last time we talked mostly about bugs and a little bit about decomposition. Decomposition is actually such a huge topic that I don't feel that even one episode of a podcast can really, give it its due time, and certainly not what I call these episodes are sampler platter episodes where I talk just a little bit about each topic, and then you can kind of get an idea of how in future episodes and future seasons I'm going to some of the things I'm going to address. And so today we're going to start out. Usually I do like a recap. There weren't really any questions from the last episode. I feel like there were more comments than anything. People who were, horrified about, warm dead bodies, horrified about the various bugs and spiders and things like that. And of course, the very odd story I told about the guy just standing in the morgue, just with the bodies, still puzzles me to this day. But I guess that's what he was into at the time. So, also going to talk about, usually I do kind of a recap, but don't really need to recap the last one, I don't think. I did want to make a quick statement that my website, which is, of course, knifeafterdeath.com, has a little area where you can sign up for a weekly digest. And what that means is, I send out like a little newsletter. So it'll be something like a case of the week, or it'll be maybe an update on a project I'm working on, like if I'm writing a book, or if I have maybe new videos on my YouTube channel or something like that. I haven't gotten around to sending them out yet. Having a website and not having really any staff is kind of a little bit of a, there's a lot to it. And, I have been busy in my own actual work life. Unfortunately, podcasting and talking about forensics and teaching forensics is not my job. I mean, it is part of my job when I'm, doing an autopsy and somebody comes to visit. But this podcast is for now kind of a side hobby for me. I actually still have to go work and do autopsies, and it's been very busy. In fact, I would say this October has been my busiest month in a year, maybe. So a lot of stuff going on. On that note, I had made a comment about how, and this was on my Instagram, people say, oh, well, you must be getting lots of suicides and lots of homicides. Well, I am getting a little more homicides in the last 2 months than I usually have. But suicides, of course, the question is, are you having more suicide cases because of the pandemic that's going on and people are getting depressed? People are getting, sort of pandemic fatigue, and then they're basically deciding to kill themselves, or maybe they've had some kind of financial hardship and then they decide to kill themselves. But what I had commented was I actually had one of my assistants at the main place where I work run the numbers, and it turns out suicide numbers were actually down for 2020 compared to the previous 2 or 3 years. And I don't really have a good theory, I guess I should say hypothesis, on why that is the case. In some areas around the country, and I had some people write me on Instagram and say, well, in our area, we have a lot of suicides. They're definitely increased. So people have said, well, what's your hypothesis? I don't have one because it's probably random variation. In my area, there's not very much suicide this year, and in another area, it's increased. I don't know if maybe it's because in my area, the pandemic isn't, maybe it hasn't hit as hard as other areas around the country, although cases are rising where I am. But it's really hard to say. But in my own personal experience, and I cover a fairly large area, and I'm just one guy, so I do every autopsy that comes in. Really, suicide numbers have been down, and I'm not sure I've even done one in the last 6 or 7 weeks, um, which is kind of interesting. Although I made that comment, and then immediately I got called and said, that I have an autopsy for someone who committed suicide. So it's kind of like if you work in the ER or you work somewhere and somebody says, "Oh, it's quiet," which is the worst possible thing you can say, because if somebody says that, then you're instantly going to trigger some kind of mass casualty or something. So I had made this comment about how suicide is not seeing much of it, and then literally within 12 hours I got a call to go do a suicide autopsy. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into today's episode. We're going to first talk about body parts. And, because, these are the Halloween episodes and we're supposed to be talking about creepy and unusual, scary things. Um, so far, we've talked about bodies that are intact. I mean, even decomposed bodies are still intact for all practical purposes. Um, but what about body parts? I do think that this is a little worse when you open up a body bag and you're presented with part of a human being or parts of a human being. And there are different scenarios in which that can occur. A lot of people don't realize that because they picture autopsy, they picture a body laying there. Maybe it's somebody who's been shot or somebody who's had a heart attack. But the fact is, any piece of organic tissue that is thought to be from a dead human is going to come to forensics. Now, it might be me if it has soft tissue. It should definitely come to a forensic pathologist. And if it's just bones, the forensic anthropologist will get involved. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about forensic anthropology today. We're going to have to do a whole episode on that. And, if I'm lucky, maybe I can even have a forensic anthro person to talk to as a guest, you know. But anyway, so what about body parts? Well, again, there are accidental dismemberments, and then there are purposeful dismemberments, which of course would be homicide. Um, I'm first going to talk a little bit about just generalized dismemberment from accidental cases because I tend to see these a lot more than homicidal dismemberments, at least in my area. Um, so obviously, we're talking about things that produce a great amount of force on the human body because it's quite difficult to actually tear off a limb or a head. We're talking about Halloween episodes, and I know that you've probably been watching a lot of horror films for October, and you'll see stuff like somebody like Jason from Friday the 13th has a machete and chops somebody's head off or chops somebody's arm off. It's actually quite difficult to chop human tissue like that. And of course, I talked a little bit about this in the book that I wrote, and I'll talk about that book in just a little bit. But, we have to consider that whether you're chopping a head or an arm or a leg, I mean, there's a bone in there, and the bone is extremely hard, and it takes a lot of force to go through that bone. And so simple chopping motions, we don't see that. But what I am talking about for accidental dismemberments are things like what we would call shearing forces. So a shearing force is one in which things are basically pulled apart. So you have an arm that's ripped off or you have a head that's, decapitated in an accident. And so one of the most dramatic first experiences I had with this was a case where there was a guy who was on his bicycle and he was riding his bicycle on a very busy road, a highway. It may have even been part of the interstate. And he was pedaling along, and behind him comes, of course, a very high speed vehicle, one moving probably 70 miles per hour. And for those of you not listening in the United States, I can't convert that in my head to kilometers per hour. So you can do the calculation. But suffice it to say, 70 miles per hour is about how fast you go on the interstate. Well, at any rate, this guy got hit from behind by a large vehicle. It wasn't a semi, but I think it was a van, a service van of some kind. And he was ejected from his bicycle, but flipped backwards because of the movement of the vehicle was forward, going 70 miles per hour. Um, and what happened is his body was flying backwards over the vehicle, and it just so happened that his chin, right under his chin, got caught on the very top of the windshield, and it just ripped his face off. Um, and so, and of course, his body was knocked off into the side of the road. So when I came to do an autopsy, I was presented with a bag, and I opened the body bag, and then there was a body there that simply did not have a face, and the face was in a plastic bag within the body bag. So, what I had to do is I had to, examine this face. Well, the interesting thing about it is the body had the body and the face had very little trauma to it. The vehicle was moving so fast, it just kind of knocked him backwards off the bike. And like I said, it ripped his face right off. And so it was the face and the front of the skull. So it's almost like it broke off the front of the skull and ejected the brain as well. The brain was completely ejected from the body. And so I was presented with this corpse that had an empty skull and everything was attached. And then there was a face in the bag. And the odd thing about this was the face looked completely normal. Like I said, no injuries. It just looked like a mask, really. And that was one of the most unusual dismemberment cases I had, also because there was investigating person there, an officer of some sort, and he actually had this thing on tape because I think there was a local business that was sitting there and had a camera on top of it, and so they collected the um, camera footage from these businesses around there. And anyway, I actually saw. He showed me the video of this happening, and I'm not real keen on that. I mean, but when people have videos of the death, it actually tells you a lot about the case. I don't prefer to watch those videos. I mean, there used to be a series when I was younger, and like you would go to the video store. Yes, there was video stores. It's not everything was streaming like it is now. And anyway, in this sort of special section, they would have sort of the hyper violent stuff. And there was a series called Faces of Death. I know there's a few people listening who's going to know exactly what that is when I say it. And anyway, it was a lot of these horrible accidents where people were actually getting killed. But apparently, people like to watch these. I personally don't. Uh, my job is entrenched enough in violence that I really am not a big fan of violence. People always ask me if I like violent movies and things like that. And to tell you the truth, I really don't because I see enough of it at my job. I go to my job and it's a lot of times violent death. And I think I've got my fill. I don't really need to go, satisfy that fetish in another way. So, at any rate, that was pretty unusual because usually when you have these traumatic deaths, you have so many injuries that sometimes it's almost not even recognized. It's barely recognizable as human. But in this case, it was a face in a plastic bag that looked like a mask. And so, what's more appropriate for this episode than that? Um, but yeah, so that one was probably one of the most dramatic cases because it wasn't even a decapitation. It was actually just a removal of the face with ejection of the brain, of course. Now, what are other ways that we see dismemberment? Well, industrial machinery. So, as a forensic pathologist, I have to do a lot of autopsies on workplace related deaths. And I talked about this in an earlier episode. But when somebody dies at work, you have to do an autopsy for there's various regulations like the OSHA. You have to get an autopsy for the OSHA report, but also because there's always concern or a threat for a lawsuit. For instance, if the workplace was not providing enough safety measures for the particular worker and then the worker dies, then there's a potential for a lawsuit. So that's why I always have to autopsy people if they die at work. Even if they die of a heart attack, I have to do it because um, one can never know all of the details unless an autopsy is done. So unfortunately, I see a lot. I shouldn't say a lot. I mean, I probably have one a month or something where somebody dies at work in some kind of industrial machinery, and it's variable. I mean, it can be um, farm type machinery. By the way, farms are super dangerous. The place where I live and work is a farming state. It's a farming community, and so we have farm related deaths all year. And these are people, getting run over by combines or getting caught in machinery and having their arms pulled off and things like that. So, for those of you who may be in or around farms, please take care because you can die pretty quickly. I have had, and I do. The problem is, I want to tell you about this, but I also don't want to get ultra specific on this particular type of machinery or this particular type of uh, permutation to the body, because if I get too specific on that, it's kind of like revealing case details of one specific um, person, and I really don't want to do that. But the idea is that there's a lot of these type deaths where the body is either crushed or ripped apart. And these shearing forces will sometimes, um, it will tear the arms and legs from the trunk. It will sometimes decapitate. Sometimes you'll have a crushing force that forces, the organs into a part of the body where they shouldn't be. For instance, once I was doing one of these cases, and let's just say a very, very heavy vehicle. Um, and by heavy, I'm not talking about a car or truck. I mean, it was a much heavier vehicle, which weighs probably 8 or 10 times more than a car or truck. Kind of crushed a person, and what happened was it actually squeezed the contents of the chest in through the neck and out the top of the head, so that when I was examining the body, there was no brain inside the brain case, the calvarium, the skull. Those are all synonymous terms. But in fact, the lung was inside where the brain case should be. And there's no great term for this, but in terms of the force that is applied and the result, it was a little bit like a toothpaste tube being squeezed. You squeeze the toothpaste too hard, and of course, the toothpaste comes out the top. Well, that's basically what happened in this particular case is a person was crushed and it squeezed their organs out the top of their head, but without rupturing the neck. Definitely, I've never seen that before. And so the idea is that, you know, as a forensic pathologist, not only do you have to do these workplace deaths, they're quite gruesome sometimes. And you do have to sometimes take body parts and kind of approximate them back together with the body to figure out, well, what kind of injury happened? Was this a shearing injury? Was it a clean cut? Was it, a crush injury? Was it a high speed injury? And so I think the most dramatic example in terms of dismemberments and then trying to put the puzzle back together was a plane crash case that I did. And, there are always planes crashing. I know that anybody across the country listening to this, a lot of people learn how to fly, they get a plane. And unfortunately, you see plane crashes in small planes all the time. I'm not talking about commercial airliners, that's a completely different ordeal. But um, forensic pathologists get their share of plane crashes. And so I had a very high speed plane crash at one time. And the speed, of course, is not, I didn't see the final FAA report on that in terms of the, you know, uh, the actual physics of the accident. But suffice it to say, I did have one plane crash where there were multiple passengers, and all of these passengers were completely dismembered. So that I went to do the case, and what I was presented with was 6 body bags full of body parts. And so the way that you do, and I'll probably do an episode on mass casualty at some point, but really briefly, what that entailed was myself and an assistant and a couple of other people helping out through the coroner's office, going through each bag and basically pulling out the body parts. So here's an arm, here's a leg, here's a lung, here's a kidney, and basically trying to put them back together in terms of figuring out who is who. Because if a vehicle went down, you know who was in it, and then it's important to get the body parts and the organs with the body that with the identified person. Sometimes you can't do that, but what you can do is you can look at areas that were torn, that were ripped apart, and then reapproximate them to see if they match up. You can't very well find a kidney laying in a cornfield and then say, aha, this must belong to so and so. You just do your best. And so what you do is you try to recreate each person if they're dismembered like that. And then, at that point, then you can kind of reconstitute them. You get a sense for the physics of the accident based on the level of dismemberment and the expulsion of the organs from the body, the condition of the organs, and then you can put them in their respective body bags, and then the families can know who's who. Now, of course, that's not possible. You'd have to DNA test every single organ to figure out what goes with what. But the reason why recovering all of that is important is because you have to figure out why the accident occurred, and sometimes pilot health might explain why the accident occurred. So in this particular case, that wasn't a factor. I think it was more of a weather factor. A lot of times these crashes are due to weather more than pilot error. But I did, in this case, find a heart. And in that heart, then I go ahead and dissect the heart just like I do with any regular autopsy. I don't just throw it in the bag and move on. I still dissect it anatomically like I've been trained for years and years. And there was a significant occlusion in one of the coronary arteries for this particular heart that we found, like laying in a cornfield. And that's an important piece of information because, if that turns out to be the pilot's heart, then then the question becomes, did he have a cardiac event and then lost control of the plane? And then the people that were in there didn't know how to bring the plane down safely. That wasn't the case. I'm merely giving you examples of how dismemberments and these sort of disembowelment of organs all plays together with a mass casualty type thing. So certainly it's unusual, because you're essentially at this point, you're putting together a puzzle to figure out what goes with what. So that would be under the heading of accidental. All of these ones I've talked about. But now what about homicidal dismemberments? Do we see that often? Well, no, not often. You'll see, like I've said many times, my most common cause of death with homicide is gunshot wound, and second most common cause will be stabbing, and then third would be something like strangulation. So, but occasionally you will find you'll have a coroner call you or a sheriff call you, and they have an arm that they found in the river, or they have a head or something like that, and then of course the pathologist has to examine it and then decide, is this a foul play situation? And what I'm getting at is it a foul play situation, or is it a case where someone has naturally maybe fallen in the river, drowned, and then animal activity has kind of ripped the corpse apart, which would be more likely in areas where you have larger carnivorous animals or fish, things like sharks and things like that, but or bears. But no, as far as homicides go, I have had a few of these where there's been dismemberment. The question is always, did the dismemberment occur before or after death? Was this an active process? Somebody was, running around with a samurai sword chopping off limbs, or was the body killed and then dismembered? And most often it's the latter. It's that somebody is killed in some other way and then the body is dismembered, so it's easier to get rid of. And it's kind of, I mean, it's definitely interesting. I've received my share of torsos that are found in rivers, a head every now and then, or, an extremity like a foot. Now, again, I kind of say that to make it sound like, oh, it's kind of common, but believe me, it's not that common. I don't want to say how frequent, because if I say that it's very infrequent, that means I'll get a call and I'll have one tomorrow like that. So I don't want to trigger fate. But one of the things we do is when we are presented with a body part or a thing, an item like a torso, you want to figure out, is there trauma here that explains the death? Um, are there stab wounds? Are there gunshot wounds and things like that? And I've had some tremendous cases where we've tried to solve the case, um, looking at some of these injuries. But unfortunately, some of these have been really hard to solve because you sometimes you don't even know who they are. It's just a mystery body in a river, and we can't find any identification. One of the things we do with dismemberments, though, is we look at the area that where the dismemberment occurred. So, is this an arm? Is this a leg? Is it a neck? And then what we do is we try to see if there are anatomical clues into how it was dismembered. So, does it look like a power saw was used? Does it look more like a hand saw was used? And what you can do is, particularly with bone or cartilage, you can actually sometimes you can see um, kind of the cut surface. And then what you can do is, if at some point in the future you have a possible suspect and a possible item that was used, let's say a power saw, you can compare body parts that were maybe found separately and then compare it to the type of saw mark that is made by that saw. So, it's kind of a convoluted procedure, and we can't always have all the body parts when we find these. I mean, a lot of times, like I said, it's found in a river most often. Usually, when people dismember bodies, they don't bury just one single part. Usually, bodies that are buried are usually intact because it's a lot of extra work. And I know that sounds silly because we're talking about, somebody murdering somebody, but usually when somebody murders somebody in that way, they're just trying to get rid of the body as quickly as they can, so that they can, try to get away with it. And so most often with buried bodies, I've found that they're intact, and bodies in water, lakes and rivers and things like that, sometimes will be dismembered. Now, most commonly when you find a body in water, it's neither. It's not even a homicide. It's somebody who's drowned, and then their body is found, 7, 8 days later. Or it's somebody who, and this was a very common thing that I had for whatever reason in 2018. I had a lot of people who were on drugs who would then fall in the river or stumble into the water and drown while they were on drugs. I felt like I had so many of those cases. But of course, these don't end up as dismemberments, but they do decay rapidly in water. Again, we'll cover all that process of decay in a future episode. But I think that covers mostly what we want to talk about on dismemberments. The idea being that it is very unusual. It is kind of creepy to open a body bag and then you've just got human body parts. And then two, trying to put the puzzle back together if you can. So, if you think you want to be a forensic pathologist, it's not all just autopsies looking for bullets or looking for heart attacks. I mean, sometimes you have to do these gruesome things and, kind of put bodies back together. And by the way, when I say put bodies back together, we don't sew them back together. We're basically approximating the pieces. So to say that this arm goes with this torso, this head goes with that torso, this leg goes with that foot, that sort of thing. Because ultimately, these bodies have to be given back to a family and then they have their, whatever funeral process they're going to have. Now, what else can we talk about today? We were going to talk about exhumations. To exhume the body is to take it out of the ground. And for me, I feel like in terms of what do you find creepiest, Dr. Wolf? I think exhumations are, for me, the creepiest, particularly those that are already in caskets. I'll explain why in a moment. I don't really have a good reason why. It's just that it's like not having a a food that's not your favorite, or a something that turns you on or turns you off. It's just one of those things. A corpse, a body that's in a casket is for some reason it bothers me. Speaking of food, I meant to say that I had a lot of people ask about fly eggs from the last episode. Remember, I talked about fly eggs and I said it's either like Parmesan cheese or it's like sawdust, and that I prefer sawdust. Well, I had Parmesan cheese on my lunch today and I looked closely at it, and to me, it doesn't look like fly eggs. I don't know why people are calling this Parmesan cheese, because Parmesan is more granular. It's like little pieces, whereas fly eggs are more like they're sort of oblong, almost needle-like, and you can imagine what sawdust looks like. So anyway, a little aside there, but if you didn't listen to the last episode, you might want to circle back and listen to that, because I talk about what flies and fly eggs and maggots and that process. And anyway, so back to exhumations. So there are really two scenarios where we have an exhumed body. One is where a body part is found um, by on accident sometimes, or for instance, if somebody is buried surreptitiously, somebody's been murdered and they've been buried. Erosion occurs, animal activity occurs, and then you've got an arm or something, or a bone that's found on top of the surface, and then the digging occurs and gets the body out. The second are exhumations from, like I said before, people who have already been buried in coffins and caskets, and that we have to do autopsies. Yes, we have to do autopsies on both of those. So let's talk briefly about the first, which would be kind of a natural exhumation of a body that has been buried not inside of a container. So what you're picturing is, when you've watched Forensic Files or one of these shows, or even some of your shows that are fiction, where somebody kills someone, they drive way out into the woods or out into a cornfield, they dig a grave, usually a shallow grave, push the body in it, bury it, and then hope it never gets found. And there are probably an awful lot of bodies in the ground right now that are never found. But they do come to the surface. We do find them, and then we do have to have them exhumed professionally. So one case, which was pretty interesting to me, and this one has a lot of elements to it that I'll probably do as a case study at some time in the future. But basically, there was a rural county where I live. Most of the counties where I live are rural, but we're talking like lots of farmhouses and farms and cornfields, and really not much going on. And a farmer is, he's got his dog, because everybody's got their dog, and the dog comes and brings him something. It's just like in the evening, I guess he's going to feed his dog. Dog comes, has something in his mouth, and drops it at the farmer's foot, and it turns out it's a hand, and it's a forearm. It is a human hand and forearm that this dog has. So, long story short, in some sort of interesting telepathy communication between the dog and the human, the dog led the farmer to the area where he got the hand and the wrist from, this forearm. And when the farmer got there, he saw that in fact the dog had dug a little bit into the ground, and there was a partial skeleton. It wasn't really a skeleton. There was still some soft tissue there, but clearly a human body. So the farmer instantly calls police. Police comes out. They call me kind of in the middle of the night and say there's going to be an exhumation. But because this body is outside, what they have to do is, the forensic pathologists, we don't go out there with shovels and dig them up and, throw them in a cart and take them away. If you're in an area that has forensic anthropologists, you could be very lucky, like I am, and have very good forensic anthropologists. And so basically, what they do is they take their time exhuming these bodies, and they make all sorts of observations about the depth and the condition of the soil and the wildlife in the area, the bug life, um, just all of these like environmental variables that are kind of to give you a sense of the condition of where this body was buried. And of course, there's a lot of evidence with that. The reports can be very long and very detailed. And I don't participate in the exhumation. Usually, it's a forensic anthropology team. They get the body out, and then it comes to me in the body bag. A lot of times, it's still covered in a lot of mud or dirt. And then at that point, I am charged with an autopsy. I have to go ahead and autopsy the body. Now, there are really, varying levels of autopsy you can do. Sometimes it's just a skeleton. And if it's just a skeleton, my purpose is simply to kind of look over everything, note what bones are there, what bones aren't there, which, by the way, forensic anthropologists are better at than pathologists. But, are there, what I'm looking for is signs of injury. So if I'm presented with a skull, then I'm looking for gunshot wounds. I'm looking for something that indicates maybe the person was bashed in the head, that sort of thing. You look at the teeth because obviously you can use dental records to do an identification. And then there are other bodies which are more freshly buried. Some of the bodies I've had have been buried, a couple of days through a couple of months. And you'd be surprised at how good of condition a body can be in buried for a couple of months. I had one that was buried in the winter, and of course it's cold in the winter, so it's well preserved. And then I think we got the body out in the spring. I think it was maybe not quite spring. It was kind of early March, maybe. And, you really, there was a little bit of um, deformity of the face, but there wasn't any bug activity because below a certain level of the ground, I think it's about 6 inches or 8 inches, something like that, you're not going to get the exposure of the body, and you're not going to have a lot of bug activity, such as on the surface, you're going to have flies laying eggs, maggots are going to form, then maggots devour the flesh. So I've done exhumations of bodies which have been buried a couple of months, and they're in really pretty good condition. And on one of them, we were able to actually get liquid blood for toxicology. I don't know if anybody will believe that, but I have no reason to lie. I witnessed it myself. We put a needle into the heart and withdrew blood, and we're able to send that for toxicology. And really, probably what it was is the person went into the ground and the ground froze, and they were basically, frozen in time until it started to thaw. So, what do we do in that case? Well, we have organs and everything with body like that, so we do it like a regular autopsy. It just sometimes takes a little longer because they're caked with mud and we have to wash them off, but we have to be careful to preserve any evidence that we find. We have to be careful about injuries. Things like one thing to note, and I didn't mention with the last one, is for instance, if you've got a gunshot wound or you've got, let's say, a knife wound, um, maggots love and bugs love to be in areas of injury first. So it's because they like moist areas, like I mentioned. So if you have a gunshot wound or a knife wound, then you've got tissue exposed, and it's a little bit wet there because there's going to be blood or there's going to be lymph. And so the flies and the maggots love that. So you have to be very careful when you examine these bodies to figure out, well, what is injury? Is it a real injury, or is this something that's been kind of eaten away by maggots? So, I mean, I'm not going to necessarily go into every case that I've done for these homicidal exhumations, but let's just say there's been a few, and varying conditions of the body. You always have to X-ray these bodies, and if you're lucky, you'll get a CT scan. If you live in a place that does CT scans, you're very lucky. It's very hard for me to get CT scans on dead bodies where I live because most hospitals don't want corpses to be brought in. It's not ideal for them, especially when they're very smelly, because there are patients in these hospitals, and you don't want to be bringing decomposed bodies into a hospital. You're patient satisfaction scores are definitely going to go down on that. So, what we do is we have a mobile X-ray unit who we call, and they come and they do X-rays, and then we look at all the X-rays before we open the body, because what we're looking for is we're looking for signs of gunshot wounds. We're looking for bullets, bullet jackets. We're looking for possible injuries to the body, so fractures of the arms and the legs and the skull and things like that that could explain a bullet passing through. Also, rarely you'll find a knife tip. If somebody's been stabbing somebody, you'll find the knife tip broken off in the body. That's important for a couple of reasons, because if you can find the knife itself that has a broken piece and then you recover the knife tip, then you know you can match them together, and that's a great piece of evidence for the eventual trial. The other is, if you've got a knife tip, you don't want to be rummaging around in the body without knowing that it's there, or you could cut yourself. So that's why x-rays are really important in these exhumation cases. And we'll talk a lot more about these in the future. I'll probably dedicate at least an entire episode to the process of exhumation, how we go through getting identity on people, because a lot of times, like I said, we have to try to find DNA. We have to try to find, sometimes dental records if they have fillings or things in their teeth, because identity is one of the number one things when it comes to getting an exhumed body. A lot of times the facial features are not intact very well, so you have to use other means. Now, what about bodies that are in coffins? Of course, this is sort of my kryptonite. I don't like these. Um, I don't really know anybody who likes these. I guess if you like to autopsy bodies that have already been embalmed and buried, you are definitely a special person. Um, it's not for me though. So why do we do these? Well, sometimes what happens is there will be a question about, well, I think maybe this person was murdered. Maybe it's a year later, it might be 5 years later. And a family member will say, well, or somebody else will say, I have evidence, or I have some, kind of confession that somebody harmed this person, and we need to, do an autopsy and find out. And, if there's credible reason for it, they will exhume the body. Another is, and I've had a couple of these, are medical malpractice cases where somebody got buried, um, after a death or something. Um, let's say it was after, some kind of medical procedure or something. Time goes by, and then they realize they didn't get an autopsy, and they need an autopsy to prove or disprove that there was some kind of harm from a medical perspective. So I have had to do these for medical malpractice cases where, the body will be, you have to bring the body up and you have to do a full autopsy. And so I know you're probably thinking, well, why, Dr. Wolfe, are you so disturbed by bodies in coffins? Well, it's not that I don't know. I'm not a big fan of breathing in all of that embalming fluid. And you can still smell it. You can still sense it, even if somebody's been buried for a couple of years. Secondly is, when tissues are embalmed, when human tissues are embalmed, and I'm assuming it's the same with animals as well. I mean, the point is, human tissues are usually soft, but when you embalm them, they become fixed. Embalming fluid contains, methanol and formaldehyde and things like that, and these are meant to prevent the body from decaying. So what happens is the tissues are fixed; they're very firm. And when you try to do an autopsy on a body where the tissues are very firm, it is a very labor intensive thing. I am usually exhausted after I do a case of an embalmed body. And then plus you've got the issue of all of this embalming fluid. So usually I wear a P100 mask when I do these. And a P100, by the way, it looks a little bit like a gas mask. It's not a full gas mask that, filters out chemical agents and nuclear fallout and things like that. But it's mainly, it just helps you breathe a little bit better. You don't have to worry as much about microorganisms. I still wear it during, cases when I do potential COVID cases. But definitely you have to gown up and a lot. You have to put a lot more PPE on. Of course, in the time of a pandemic, we're always decked out in PPE anyway, so it doesn't really matter now. but the tissues are just not as pliable. So it's very difficult to do something like take the larynx out with the tongue together intact on a body that's been embalmed. So, just from a technical perspective, I'm irritated at these cases, but I do them because I am trained to do it. People ask me to do them. They're just not my favorite. And the state of the body, I guess it's a little weird because this person they've died, they've had their funeral, family members and loved ones have come. They're in their suit or their dress, they have their jewelry on, and this is the last way that anyone ever saw them. And then what we have to do is we have to take everything off and we have to be very neat about it. You can't just cut somebody's suit off or somebody's dress and then, of course, all of the jewelry and things like that. You need to take it off in a way that you can put it right back on, or at least send it back to the funeral home for them to put it back on. So it's a very time intensive procedure. And then it's a labor intensive procedure. And then, of course, there's the irritation of the embalming fluid and things like that. So it's just a little creepy to think that, well, here's a person who's had their funeral, they've had their last rites, they've had their service, now they're buried, and then now I'm seeing them again. I'm the first person to lay eyes on them since they went in the ground and got buried under 6 feet of dirt. So it's a little bit of an unusual feeling. And, another thing is, this is the actual worst, is when the coffin itself leaks. And not all, I mean, coffins today, I imagine the technology is really good. I don't really know a lot about mortuary science. I know there's probably a lot of people listening who do. And I know that the coffins of today are much better than they were, let's say, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And certainly beyond that, we're talking about getting in pine boxes and things like that. The point I'm making is that sometimes groundwater will leak into a coffin, um, and you'll see it won't necessarily be sopping wet in there, but what happens is you'll get the formation of what's called adipocere. Adipocere, ADIPOCERE, is sort of fatty substance that forms when bodies are kind of in moist, wet, cold areas. And of course, that would definitely fit the profile of a coffin, being dark, wet, and cold. And what happens is it's kind of a greasy gray white mess that forms. And so the tissue itself starts to form all of this adipocere, and it can really form these interesting patterns, and it can kind of envelop, and it kind of melts away the tissue. You kind of lose appreciation for the how the body might look. The more adipocere that forms, you lose the anatomy. You don't see it as well. I have done I done let's see, I had one case where we had a body that was buried almost 5 decades ago, and took it out, and it was really degenerated into mostly adipocere. And the only thing I can compare it to is, in Star Wars, when Han Solo is put into carbonite, and then he's in that big plate of carbonite, and he's sort of, you can see him screaming. It's a little bit like that. It sort of feels like it just filled the bottom of the coffin. The tissue kind of melted. It kind of formed what you would imagine to be like a big, thick plate of adipocere, and then the bones were embedded in that adipocere. So what I had to do is I had to take these very large knives. We're not talking about scalpels. We're talking about these huge blades, and cut all of the adipocere away in order to harvest the bones to give to the anthropologist. Now, the adipocere was the consistency of rubber. So I had to basically carve all of this adipocere off the bones and give them to the forensic anthropologist, and then they do other procedures to melt away the tissue so that they can assess the bones and get an idea for some of the various conditions they have, and they can make particularly if you don't know a gender, they can say that, well, looks more like a female pelvis, or this looks like this kind of skull. This particular case I'm talking about was a murder case, so we were trying to harvest some tissue or some bone in order to get DNA so that we could try to find out a better identity of the person because it was a Jane Doe. So yeah, buried bodies in coffins. That's my least favorite thing. I think it's the thing that creeps me out the most of all of the pathology stuff, except for maybe large wolf spiders inside of dead, skeletons. That's pretty much a tie for me. And then, you know, this is, I don't really know that I have much else to say about exhumed bodies in this case, but definitely this probably is a good place to stop for in terms of the discussion of some of the Halloween creepy forensics type stuff. It would be a shame if I didn't plug my own book at this point. Many of you listening know that last year I wrote a book about zombies. It was called The Handbook of Zombie Forensics and Medicine. And basically, that book, which is available at Amazon.com, it goes through and kind of scientifically breaks down what a zombie apocalypse would look like from a medical perspective, from a forensics perspective, best ways to kill a zombie and things like that using all this forensic knowledge that I have. And it was kind of weird because I wrote this book with the idea of billing the zombie apocalypse like a pandemic. And this was I was writing it in August and September of 2019, and I was doing all this stuff about pandemics. I released it in October 2019, kind of at the end of October through November 2019. And again, it did pretty well. It's on Amazon.com. At this point, you can buy it maybe for a Christmas gift. So see, I'm kind of just doing an ad for myself right now. You have to bear with me because I didn't have any commercials today. So yeah, the Handbook of Zombie Forensics and Medicine, and then you can look that up on Amazon, and you can let me know what you think about it if you haven't read it. And my goal was to write another book for this fall. I wanted to release a Halloween project every year, and so as it turned out, this late summer and fall, what I did was I created the podcast. So that was my one creative thing for the year, was to do my podcast where I could do a little bit of teaching and kind of talk about some of my experiences. And then hopefully things in 2021 will get back and I can start putting out more books and things like that. So, to finish up, if you're just listening for the first time, my Instagram is called @AnatomyAndTheDead. There's an underscore between each one. I have a second Instagram page, which is not quite as functional as the Anatomy and the Dead, and it is called Knife After Death, obviously, because that's the name of this podcast. YouTube channel also under the same name, and of course, my website, knifeafterdeath.com. So, next time we have a podcast, we're going to go ahead and talk about some regular forensic stuff, no specialty episodes on Halloween forensics because Halloween will be over. So if you have any special requests, of course, you can always message me and ask about some things you want to hear about. But the topics in forensics are nearly endless that you can go and talk about because we have to know every single way a person dies and every disease that you can imagine. So I've got some ideas on how I'm going to finish up season 1. But with that being said, I'm going to let you go, and happy Halloween, and I hope you all have an excellent weekend. Thank you.